What if I told you that 150 Australians in open-top trucks, no armor, no doors, no windshields, did what the entire United States military could not? What if I told you they did it weeks ahead of schedule, with a fraction of the budget? And when the Americans finally showed up with their 68-ton tanks and their $100 million battle plan, the Australians were already sitting on the runway, drinking tea. The Pentagon has never been comfortable talking about what happened in the Iraqi desert in 2003. And tonight, you are going to find out exactly why. We are taking you inside one of the most embarrassing moments in modern American military history and one of the most extraordinary special forces operations ever conducted by any country, anywhere. The Australian SAS went into the Western Desert outnumbered, outgunned, and written off as suicidal by every American officer who saw their vehicles. What happened next rewrote the rules of modern warfare. The Americans called their machines suicide vehicles. The Iraqis thought they were facing an army of thousands. And by the time the truth came out, an airbase the size of a small city, packed with buried fighter jets and hidden weapons, had already changed hands. Mid-April 2003, the western Iraqi desert. A column of American M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks rolls toward the perimeter of Asad Airbase, the second largest military airfield in the entire country. Dust clouds rise hundreds of feet into the pale sky. The rumble of 68-ton war machines shakes the hardpan for miles. Gunners sit behind thermal optics, fingers hovering over triggers, expecting a firestorm of resistance the moment they breach the outer wire. Artillery coordinates are locked. Close air support orbits overhead. Medevac helicopters idle at the rear, rotors turning, stretchers ready. The 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment has been briefed for a brutal fight. A base crawling with Republican Guard remnants, Fedayeen fanatics, and enough anti-aircraft hardware to turn the sky black. Every American soldier in that column has been told to expect significant casualties. And then somebody radios the lead tank commander with a message that, according to multiple accounts, caused a silence so long the comms operator thought the frequency had gone dead. The gates of Asad Airbase are wide open. There is no enemy. There is no resistance. There is nothing but a few dozen sunburned, dust-caked Australians sitting on the main runway, boiling water on portable stoves, drinking tea, and cleaning their weapons as if they had checked into a holiday campsite 3 days early and were wondering what took everybody so long. The entire multi-million-dollar American assault plan, the B-52 sorties, the tank battalions, the artillery barrages, the weeks of intelligence briefings, was, in one absurd and magnificent moment, completely unnecessary. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had already taken the base, not with heavy armour, not with overwhelming firepower, not with a plan that cost $100 million and filled a room full of Pentagon planners. They had done it with open-top Land Rovers, a handful of dirt bikes, and the kind of aggressive audacity that made American commanders question whether the Geneva Convention covered sheer bloody-mindedness. But how on earth did 150 men in unarmored vehicles accomplish what the most powerful military on the planet was still gearing up to do? That story begins weeks earlier on the Jordanian border with a confrontation that had nothing to do with the Iraqis and everything to do with the oldest rivalry in the coalition. March 2003. In the classified planning rooms of Central Command in Qatar, the real argument is not about whether to invade Iraq, that decision has already been made, but about how to control the vast western desert stretching from the Jordanian border to the Euphrates River. This is not a sideshow. This is the region from which Saddam Hussein launched Scud missiles at Israel during the First Gulf War in 1991, and the Pentagon is terrified that he will do it again. If a single Scud lands on Tel Aviv, Israel enters the war, the Arab coalition collapses, and the entire political architecture of the invasion falls apart overnight. The Americans want to flood the western desert with conventional forces, armored brigades, mechanized infantry, attack helicopters, the classic American way of war. Identify a problem, throw a mountain of steel and dollars at it, grind it flat. But there is a complication. The western desert of Iraq is roughly the size of the United Kingdom, featureless, flat, baked to a pale crust, and crisscrossed by thousands of kilometers of unmarked tracks. Conventional armored columns move through this terrain at the pace of a limping camel. Tanks burn fuel at a catastrophic rate. Supply lines stretch dangerously thin, and ambushes become trivially easy when every vehicle kicks up a dust signature visible from 20 kilometers away. Into this planning vacuum steps a force that most American staff officers have barely heard of. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, based out of Campbell Barracks in Perth, Western Australia. The SASR has been quietly deploying to the Middle East for months, staging out of a forward operating base in Jordan. Their commander presents a proposal to CENTCOM that by several accounts is met with something between polite skepticism and outright laughter. The Australians want to take the entire western desert, all of it, not a sector, not a corridor, the whole thing. 150 operators with a small number of support elements propose to do the job that the American planners have earmarked for thousands of troops and billions of dollars worth of hardware. And they want to do it in vehicles that make the average American staff officer physically uncomfortable just looking at them. Behind that proposal sat decades of institutional knowledge the Pentagon had never encountered. During World War II, Australia contributed some of the most effective long-range patrol units in the Allied order of battle. Fighting across Libya, Egypt, New Guinea, and Borneo gave Australian soldiers skills no funding could replicate. Survival in hostile terrain with almost nothing, navigation without technology, and fighting with speed rather than mass. When the SASR was formally raised in 1957, it inherited that DNA. By Vietnam, the unit had earned a reputation that defied categorization. Small, quiet patrols that vanished into jungle for weeks and fought with ferocity wildly out of proportion to their numbers. By 2003, East Timor, Afghanistan, and classified deployments had given its operators combat experience almost unmatched anywhere. But none of that history mattered to the American staff officers staring at the Australian vehicles in Jordan. What mattered was what they could see with their own eyes, and what they saw horrified them. The primary fighting vehicle of the Australian SASR in Iraq was the Long-Range Patrol Vehicle, or LRPV, a six-wheeled Land Rover chassis stripped of everything that added weight and reduced visibility. The roof was gone. The doors were gone. The windshield was gone. What remained was a tubular steel roll cage bolted to a flat chassis with bench seating and mounting points for weapons. The Americans reportedly used the phrase suicide machines. The LRPV had 0 ballistic protection. A single rifle round could punch straight through the cab space. No armor plating against mines, no armored glass, no reactive panels. But here is what the Americans missed. Armor is a philosophy, not just a material. The American philosophy was straightforward. Make the vehicle so tough it absorbs punishment and keeps fighting. The Australian philosophy was the exact opposite. Make it so fast and agile it never gets hit in the first place. An Abrams tank moves at roughly 65 kilometers per hour on a good road and considerably less across broken desert. An LRPV, stripped down and tuned by mechanics who treated their machines the way jockeys treat racehorses, could hit 100 kilometers per hour across open hardpan. It could turn on a coin. It could reverse direction in seconds. And because it was open-topped with 360-degree visibility, every crew member could see threats, identify targets, and return fire simultaneously, without peering through a narrow slit in a steel box. The weapons mounted on these skeletal frames were anything but lightweight. Each LRPV typically carried a Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun, a 7.62 mm general purpose machine gun, and in many cases a Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher effective out to over 2,000 meters. Some vehicles also carried Javelin anti-tank guided missile systems, giving a crew of 3 or 4 men in an open truck the ability to destroy a main battle tank from 2.5 kilometers away. Add the personal weapons, M4 carbines, Minimi light machine guns, and the devastating AW-50F long-range sniper rifle capable of punching through an engine block at 1,500 meters. And each LRPV was less a vehicle and more a mobile weapons platform disguised as a piece of outback scrap metal. Several days before the first cruise missiles lit up Baghdad on the night of March the 19th, Australian SASR patrols crossed the border from Jordan into western Iraq. No fanfare, no massive logistical tail, no tank transporters or fuel convoys. Just small groups of LRPVs and dirt bikes slipping across the frontier in pre-dawn darkness. Their mission was breathtaking in its ambition and almost reckless in its simplicity. Secure the entire western desert of Iraq. Deny the enemy the ability to launch ballistic missiles toward Israel or Jordan. Locate and destroy any Scud launchers, weapons caches, or command nodes, and interdict enemy communications across a battle space of roughly 350,000 square kilometers. That territory was larger than Poland. The force assigned to control it would not fill a large commercial aircraft. By any conventional military calculation, this was not a mission. It was a mathematical impossibility. But the SASR did not operate by conventional calculations. They operated by principles refined over 60 years of fighting in deserts, jungles, and mountains. Principles built on one uncomfortable truth. You do not need to hold ground if you can make the enemy terrified to use it. Within the first 72 hours of crossing the border, the SASR patrols made contact with enemy forces, and the results were immediate, violent, and deeply confusing for the Iraqis. Standard Iraqi defensive doctrine in the western desert relied on observation posts, small garrisons, and mobile patrols using armed pickup trucks, the ubiquitous Toyota Hilux and Land Cruiser Technicals that had become the signature vehicle of irregular warfare across the Middle East. The Iraqis expected any coalition force in the deep desert to move cautiously, establish forward operating bases, and advance methodically. What they got instead was a swarm. Australian LRPV patrols, typically operating in groups of 4 to 6 vehicles, roared across the desert at speeds the Iraqis simply could not match or predict. They appeared out of dust clouds on one flank, unleashed devastating volleys of .50 caliber and grenade fire, and disappeared before the Iraqis could bring their own weapons to bear. When Iraqi columns attempted to pursue in their armed technicals, the Australians executed a tactic that became the signature move of the entire campaign. The lead LRPV would slow just enough to draw the pursuing vehicles into a chase. Iraqi drivers, sensing an opportunity, would accelerate, bunching their vehicles together on the narrow desert tracks. And then, from a flanking position 800 to 1,500 meters away, an Australian sniper with an AW-50F anti-materiel rifle would begin methodically putting rounds through the engine blocks of the lead and rear vehicles. The column would grind to a halt, boxed in by its own wrecks, and the remaining LRPVs would wheel around and rake the stalled convoy with heavy machine gun fire from multiple angles. Every destroyed Iraqi column sent a clear and terrifying message to the surviving garrisons. These people are faster than you. They see you before you see them, and your vehicles offer no protection whatsoever. The Iraqis began abandoning their observation posts. Patrols refused to leave their bases after dark. Communications between Iraqi units collapsed as the Australians systematically targeted radio relay stations, fiber optic junctions, and command vehicles. Within a single week, the Iraqi military presence in the western desert was not defeated in the traditional sense. It was paralyzed. Units that still had men, weapons, and ammunition simply stopped operating because they had lost all confidence in their ability to move without being intercepted by an enemy they could not see, could not predict, and could not outrun. But the Desert War was only the opening act. The real prize was still sitting behind concrete blast walls and razor wire, 250 kilometers deeper into Iraq. Asad Airbase was one of the crown jewels of Saddam Hussein's military infrastructure, a sprawling complex in Anbar province covering roughly 50 square kilometers, larger than many international airports. Built with Yugoslav engineering assistance in the 1980s, it featured 2 runways each over 3,500 meters long, hardened aircraft shelters designed to survive direct bomb hits, underground ammunition stores, fuel depots, and command bunkers that made it a self-contained military city. Before the invasion, al-Assad housed squadrons of MiG-25 Foxbat interceptors, Mark III capable aircraft that genuinely worried coalition air planners, and was believed to contain chemical weapons delivery systems. For CENTCOM, this was a Tier 1 objective. The American plan for taking al-Assad followed the standard heavy assault template. First, waves of precision-guided munitions from B-52 bombers and F-15E Strike Eagles would crater the runways and suppress defenses. Then the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment would advance under Apache helicopter cover, breach the perimeter, and clear the base compound by compound in a sweep expected to take days and cost dozens of casualties. The planning documents ran to hundreds of pages. The logistics alone, fuel, ammunition, medical support, engineer assets, chemical decontamination teams, required a dedicated supply chain. The cost ran well into the tens of millions of dollars before a single shot was fired. But while the Americans were still marshalling their forces, moving tanks off rail cars, stockpiling ammunition, running exhaustive rehearsals, the SASR patrols in the western desert were already closing on the base from multiple directions. This was not a planned divergence from the coalition timeline. The Australians had been so effective in clearing the Western Desert that they had simply run out of things to fight. The observation posts were abandoned. The convoys had stopped moving. The garrisons were either destroyed, had surrendered, or had melted into the civilian population. Asad Airbase, sitting in the middle of a now pacified desert, was the next logical objective. Patrol commanders reported the approaches were clear. The outer defensive positions, minefields, observation towers, fighting positions that American intelligence had meticulously mapped and planned to neutralize, appeared unmanned. The Fedayeen fighters, who were supposed to defend the base, had taken one look at what was happening to every Iraqi unit in the open desert and made the entirely rational decision to be somewhere else. The SASR commander faced a choice that, in the rigid world of coalition command structures, was not really his to make. The base was an American objective, assigned to an American unit, on an American timeline. Protocol demanded that the Australians hold their positions and wait for the heavy armor. The official Australian version describes a careful reconnaissance in force that transitioned into an assault when minimal resistance was encountered. The unofficial version, the one told in bars and barracks for years afterward, involves considerably less hesitation. SASR patrols approached the base perimeter from multiple axes, using the same high-speed techniques that had shattered Iraqi resistance across the western battle space. Scout elements on dirt bikes raced ahead, confirming the minefields were poorly laid, incomplete, or already breached by deserting Iraqi soldiers. The patrols hit the perimeter wire and blew through without stopping. There was no prolonged breach, no engineer teams clearing lanes, no infantry dismounting to sweep bunkers under tank cover. The LRPVs found gaps, made gaps, or drove through gaps, and within minutes, Australian vehicles were inside the perimeter and fanning out across the taxiways. Resistance was scattered, disorganized, and brief. Small groups of defenders opened fire from isolated positions, but were quickly suppressed by the overwhelming volume of fire that half a dozen LRPVs brought to bear. A .50 caliber machine gun at close range is not a weapon you argue with. Within hours, not days, not the week-plus American timeline, the Australian SASR had secured the critical infrastructure of Asad Airbase. The runways were clear. The control tower was occupied. The hardened aircraft shelters were being opened and searched. What the Australians found inside those shelters became one of the most remarkable discoveries of the entire war. Buried in sand alongside the taxiways and hidden inside blast-proof bunkers were more than 50 Iraqi combat aircraft, including multiple MiG-25 Foxbat interceptors. The Iraqis, realizing they could not fly against coalition air supremacy, had literally tried to bury their air force, shoveling tons of sand over the airframes in a desperate attempt to hide them from American satellites. The Australians found every single one. They also uncovered enormous stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, and explosives representing a significant fraction of Iraq's Western military infrastructure. And having accomplished all of this with fewer men than a single American infantry company, they did what Australian soldiers have always done at the end of a hard job. They put the kettle on. The official reports describe a smooth handover when the Americans finally rolled through the open gates. The unofficial accounts are less diplomatic. The American commander who led the tank column into Al-Assad was reportedly not amused to discover his entire operation. The tanks The artillery, the air support, the medevac, the $100 million plan had been rendered unnecessary by 150 men in what he had previously called suicide machines. The Australians, for their part, greeted the Americans with characteristic understatement. One account describes an SASR patrol commander walking up to the lead vehicle and delivering a status briefing with all the urgency of a real estate agent showing a rental property, pointing out which buildings were clear, where the captured aircraft were parked, and where the tea was brewing. The capture of Al-Assad was not widely reported at the time. The Australian government kept quiet about special operations. The American media was fixed on the thunder run into Baghdad and the toppling of Saddam's statue. And the episode was, frankly, embarrassing for the larger coalition partner. But within the professional military community, among the planners at CENTCOM, the operators at Joint Special Operations Command, and analysts at defense think tanks across 3 continents, the operation became a defining case study in asymmetric effectiveness. A force of roughly 150 operators equipped with vehicles costing a fraction of a single Abrams tank, operating without heavy armor or dedicated air cover for most of their mission, had not only secured a battle space the size of Great Britain, but captured one of the most significant military objectives in the entire theater before conventional forces could even get into position. Iraqi prisoners captured during the campaign provided perhaps the most telling assessment of all. They repeatedly described a force that seemed to be everywhere at once, attacked from directions nobody expected, and vanished before anyone could respond. Some believed they were facing a force of thousands. The idea that fewer than 200 men were responsible for the complete collapse of military operations across the western third of the country was simply not credible to them. The Americans brought a $100 million plan and an armored fist. The Australians brought tea bags and audacity, and when the dust settled over Al-Asad Airbase, it was the tea drinkers sitting on the runway and the armored fist standing at the gate, processing what had just happened.